The transport skiff banked hard through crystalline spires that shouldn't have been possible according to any physics Kale understood, and his stomach attempted a brave escape through his throat. Gravity here was more of a polite suggestion than a law, which made the floating citadel of House Velshara either an architectural marvel or an elaborate death trap. Possibly both. "Try not to vomit on the landing platform," his escort said without looking back. Her name was something with too many syllables that Kale's human tongue mangled into what sounded like a sneeze, so she'd given up and told him to call her Sira. Her ears, long and tapered like elegant knife blades, twitched with what he suspected was amusement at his discomfort. "No promises," Kale managed, gripping the seat restraints as the skiff performed another maneuver that violated several conventions about up and down. "You know where I come from, we generally keep buildings on the ground. Crazy concept, I know, but it cuts down on the motion sickness. Where you come from, you also thought projectile weapons were peak military technology until 15 years ago. Hey, bullets are reliable. They don't need calibration crystals or harmonic resonance or whatever mystical nonsense powers your gear." Sira's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. The Ithari didn't smile often, Kale had learned during his 3 months of diplomatic preparation. Emotions were weakness, desire was strength, mercy was incomprehensible. He'd studied the cultural briefings until his eyes bled, memorized the proper forms of address, learned which gestures meant respect and which ones would get him killed in a duel before breakfast. None of it had prepared him for the reality of being summoned here, to the heart of a noble house that could probably buy and sell Earth's entire defense budget with pocket change. The war had ended 6 months ago, more from mutual exhaustion than any real resolution. Humans and Ithari had battered each other across a dozen systems until both sides realized the cost of victory would be civilizational suicide. The armistice treaty was signed in neutral space, and everyone pretended it was diplomacy rather than desperate pragmatism. Kale had been rotating back to Earth for debriefing when the orders came through: new assignment, pack for extended stay, and try not to cause an intergalactic incident. His commanding officer had clapped him on the shoulder and said something encouraging about being humanity's goodwill ambassador, which really meant you're on your own, try not to die. The skiff descended toward a platform that materialized out of thin air, or what looked like thin air, until the holographic camouflage dropped and revealed a landing zone large enough to park a frigate. Figures waited in formation, their formal robes catching the light of 3 moons that hung in defiance of orbital mechanics. Kale's briefing materials had mentioned something about gravitational manipulation and localized spatial folding, but he'd stopped reading when the physics made his brain hurt. "Last chance to run," Sira said as the skiff touched down with barely a whisper of displaced air. "And miss all this fun. Besides, I saved the Lord's brother from getting atomized by our own artillery. That's got to be worth at least a decent meal before they decide if I'm a guest or a prisoner. Among my people, Lieutenant Torin, the line between those two things is thinner than you might hope." The skiff's door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Kale stepped out into air that tasted like ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. The platform hummed beneath his boots with energy that made his teeth ache. The reception committee stood in perfect formation, 7 figures in ceremonial dress that probably cost more than his childhood home. Their skin held that characteristic Ithari luminescence, a faint glow that made them look like they'd swallowed starlight. Every single one of them had those distinctive ears, some adorned with jewelry that traced the elegant curves, others bare and somehow more striking for it. At the center stood Lord Andros Velshara himself, and Kale felt the full weight of that presence even from 20 paces. The man was tall even by Ithari standards, with silver threaded through black hair and eyes that held the cold assessment of someone used to deciding fates before breakfast. His ears bore a single band of metal near each tip, marking rank in a system Kale didn't fully understand but knew meant power. "Lieutenant Kale Torin," Andros said, and his voice carried across the platform without effort or artificial amplification. "You are welcome in my house." Kale gave the formal bow he'd practiced, the one that showed respect without submission. "Lord Velshara, I am honored by your invitation. Honored enough to travel alone into territory that was trying to kill you 6 months ago. Either very brave or very foolish. My commanding officer says I have a talent for being both simultaneously, my lord." Something flickered in Andros' eyes, too quick to read. "We shall see. Come, the house is eager to meet the human who apparently believes in mercy." They said it like a curse word. Kale noticed as he fell into step behind the lord. The assembled household staff parted in perfect synchronization, their faces carefully neutral in that way that meant they were absolutely judging everything about him. His uniform suddenly felt shabby despite being freshly pressed, his posture too casual, his entire species probably inadequate by standards he didn't understand. The Citadel's interior was worse than the exterior, if worse meant overwhelming and beautiful, and completely outside his frame of reference. Corridors curved in ways that shouldn't work, walls displayed images that might have been windows or might have been art, and the constant low hum of power made Kale feel like he was walking through the heart of a machine that could swallow him without noticing. Servants moved through spaces with practiced efficiency, their long ears adorned with communication devices that resembled jewelry. Nobody smiled. Nobody looked directly at him except to assess, measure, calculate value. "Your quarters are in the East Tower," Andros said without slowing his pace. "Sira will show you after dinner. Tonight you eat with the family. Tomorrow we begin understanding why I have brought you here." "May I ask what that reason is, my lord?" Andros stopped so suddenly that Kale nearly walked into him. The lord turned, and for the first time, something like genuine curiosity crossed his features. "You saved my brother's life when you could have let him die, when it would have been tactically advantageous to let him die. I want to understand what manner of creature does such a thing. Are you weak, Lieutenant? Or is there something about humanity we have failed to comprehend?" Kale met those ancient eyes and managed not to flinch. "I guess we'll find out together, my lord." "Indeed." Andros smiled, and it wasn't comforting. "Welcome to House Velshara, human. Try not to disappoint me." The combat arena smelled like ionized air and something organic that Kale's translator helpfully identified as competitive secretions, which he decided not to think about too hard. 3 weeks into his stay at House Velshara, and he'd learned that morning training was less cultural exchange and more formalized attempted murder with an audience. "Again," said Thyros, a young warrior whose ears bore the double rings of a house champion. He twirled his resonance blade in a pattern that left afterimages in the air, the weapon humming at a frequency that made Kale's bones itch. "This time, try not to embarrass your species quite so thoroughly." "I'll do my best," Kale said, resetting his stance with the practiced sword they'd given him. It was weighted wrong for human grip, balanced for Ethari physiology, and he was pretty sure it was set to deliver electric shocks just to keep things interesting. "Though I should mention that embarrassing my species is kind of my signature move." Thyros lunged without warning, because fairness was another one of those quaint human concepts the Ethari found baffling. Kale twisted sideways, muscle memory from 100 combat drops doing the work his conscious mind was too slow for. The resonance blade passed close enough that he felt the heat, and he brought his own weapon up in a counter that Thyros batted aside with contemptuous ease. "You fight like you're trying not to hurt me," Thyros said, circling. "Is this human compassion, or do you simply lack skill?" "Little of column A, little of column B." Kale tracked the other man's movement, watching the footwork rather than the blade. "Also, I'm pretty sure if I actually hurt the house champion, Lord Andros would have me ejected from the nearest airlock. My father would respect you more if you tried." The next exchange was faster. Thyros pressing the attack with combinations that should have been impossible to follow. Kale gave ground, deflecting rather than blocking, redirecting energy instead of meeting it head-on. It was the style he'd developed during the war, fighting opponents who were faster and stronger, and had weapons that made human technology look like sharpened sticks. You couldn't win through force against the Ithari. You won by being too stubborn to die and too annoying to predict. He saw the opening when Thyros overcommitted on a downward strike, expecting Kale to retreat again. Instead, Kale stepped inside the arc, swept the other man's forward leg, and rode him down to the mat with the practice blade pressed against his throat. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds, and the shock on Thyros's face was worth every bruise Kale had accumulated over the past 3 weeks. "Apologies," Kale said, offering a hand up. "That was reflex. We can pretend it didn't happen if you want." Thyros stared at the offered hand like it might be a weapon, then took it. "You fight like prey that forgot to run." "We get that a lot. Humanity's whole evolutionary strategy seems to be too dumb to quit." Kale helped haul the other man to his feet, noting the audience that had gathered at the arena's edge. "Wonderful. Nothing like humiliating a noble house's champion in front of witnesses to ensure a long, healthy stay. Good match. Your footwork is incredible, by the way. I was just lucky." "Luck," Thyros tested the word like it tasted strange. "You spend 3 weeks letting me dominate you, learning my patterns, waiting for precisely that opening. This is not luck, human. This is something else." Before Kale could respond, another voice cut through the arena's ambient hum. "It's called patience, brother. The humans seem to have an unnatural amount of it." Kale turned to find Lyra Velshara descending the observation stairs. Her silver hair caught back in a complex braid that probably required an engineering degree to achieve. She wore training gear that somehow looked formal, and her ears were bare of jewelry, which he'd learned meant she was here in an unofficial capacity. Behind her trailed 2 attendants who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. "Lady Lyra," Kale said, executing the abbreviated bow appropriate for informal settings. He'd gotten pretty good at the various bows. There were 17 different types, each with specific contexts, and mixing them up could apparently start blood feuds. "I didn't realize we had spectators for the morning humiliation ritual. Is that what you call this?" She gestured at the arena, at her brother who was still looking at Kale with reassessment in his eyes. It looked more like instruction disguised as courtesy. "I prefer to think of it as cross-cultural dialogue, through the medium of getting repeatedly hit with energy weapons." The corner of her mouth twitched, which was the closest thing to a smile he'd seen from her in 3 weeks of carefully orchestrated chance encounters. The library visits, the garden walks, the dinners where she asked pointed questions about human weakness, while he deflected with jokes about humanity's talent for failing upward into space travel. Every interaction was a test, and Kale had stopped trying to figure out if he was passing or failing. "Walk with me," Lyra said, and it wasn't quite a command but wasn't quite a request either. "Thyros, you're dismissed. Go contemplate how a human with inferior physiology managed to put you on the floor." "It was a lucky strike," Thyros muttered, but he bowed and withdrew with his dignity mostly intact. Kale fell into step beside Lyra as she led him out of the arena and into one of the Citadel's countless corridors. These ones had walls that displayed what looked like starfields, except the stars moved in patterns that suggested real-time data feeds from across the sector. The Ithari liked their reminders that they commanded systems, while humans were still figuring out basic jump drive mechanics. "You let him win for 3 weeks," Lyra said, once they were out of earshot of the attendants she dismissed with a gesture. "Why? Because beating him on day 1 would have made me an enemy. Letting him teach me, even while testing me, made me something he could respect. Maybe. And the defeat today. 3 weeks felt like long enough. Any longer and it starts looking like I can't actually fight, which doesn't help humanity's reputation. Timing is everything." She stopped walking and turned to face him fully, And Kale was struck again by how the Ithari managed to look both human and utterly alien simultaneously. Same basic features, same general structure, but something in the proportions was just slightly off in a way that his hindbrain found unsettling. The ears helped, or hurt, depending on perspective. Right now, hers were tilted forward in what his cultural briefings suggested meant focused attention. "You are not what I expected," Lyra said carefully, as if admitting this cost something. "When Father said he was bringing a human here, I expected bravado or cowering, primitive aggression or civilized weakness. You are neither." "I'm a work in progress," Kale offered. "Give me time, I'm sure I'll disappoint you properly." "You make jokes when you're uncomfortable. I make jokes when I'm breathing. It's a species trait. We evolved humor as a defense mechanism against the universe's general hostility." Against hostility. She considered this, her head tilting in a way that made her braids slide across one shoulder. Not to show dominance, but to deflect it. Exactly. You can't be threatened by someone who's already mocking themselves. Takes all the fun out of intimidation. "Is that what you think I'm doing? Intimidating you?" Kale met her eyes, those pale silver irises that seemed to catch and hold light. "Lady Lyra, you could intimidate a supernova into dimming. But I don't think that's what this is. I think you're trying to figure out if humans are worth your father's time, or if we're just another." She studied him for a long moment, and Kale had the distinct impression of being dissected by someone with a very sharp mind and no patience for fools. Then she turned and continued walking, and he hurried to keep pace. "The library," she said. "I'll show you the restricted archives. Father doesn't need to know." "Is this where you finally poisoned me? Because I should mention, my command knows where I am." "If I wanted you dead, Lieutenant Torin, you would never see it coming. No, this is where I show you something that might help you understand what you've walked into. Consider it a courtesy." "Courtesy from an Ithari noble," Kale said. "Should I be more worried or less?" Her ears twitched with what might have been amusement, definitely more. The Harvest Moon Festival transformed the Great Hall into something that belonged in a fever dream, assuming fever dreams came with gravitational anomalies and enough political intrigue to choke a small star system. Kale stood near one of the floating refreshment platforms, watching 3 moons hang in the sky through the hall's transparent ceiling and wondering if the formal jacket they'd given him was supposed to restrict breathing, or if that was just his anxiety manifesting physically. "You look like you're preparing for execution," Sira said, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of something luminescent. "Drink this. It will either help or make the evening more tolerable through chemical intervention." Kale accepted the glass and sniffed cautiously. It smelled like Starlight would smell if Starlight had opinions about proper social hierarchy. "What is it?" "Fermented crystal nectar. Perfectly safe for human biology, according to our medical staff. Probably." "The probably is what worries me." He took a sip anyway, because turning down offered drinks at an Ithari formal function was apparently tantamount to declaring war. It tasted like lightning, and honey had a complicated relationship that ended in mutual understanding. "That's actually not bad. Don't drink too much. You'll want your wits about you tonight." Sira gestured at the assembled nobility, who filled the hall like a collection of predatory birds in formal plumage. "Half these people wanted humanity glassed during the war. The other half just wanted us to stop existing in general. You're the entertainment." "Great. I've always wanted to be a performing monkey for the galactic elite." "What's a monkey?" "Small Earth primate, throws feces when agitated." Sira's ears perked forward in what he'd learned meant surprise. "And you compare yourself to this creature?" "We're aspirational as a species." She made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Laughing was apparently not dignified for house staff, especially not at a function where every gesture carried weight and meaning. Kale had been briefed extensively on tonight's protocols, which basically boiled down to stand where you're told, bow when appropriate, and try not to start any incidents that require military intervention. Lord Andros held court at the hall's center, surrounded by nobility whose names Kale had memorized and would probably forget under pressure. There was Lady Charis of House Velkoth, whose fleet had hammered human colonies in the Theta sector. Lord Ven of House Talsorin, who'd advocated for humanity's complete subjugation. High Minister Kelrose, whose ears bore so many rank markers that they looked like they'd been attacked by an aggressive jeweler. Every single one of them had spent the war trying to kill people Kale knew, and now he was expected to make pleasant conversation over crystal nectar and gravitationally suspended appetizers. "Lieutenant Torin," Andros called out, his voice cutting through the ambient conversation like a blade. "Come, let these gathered houses meet our honored guest." "Honored guest, right." Kale set down his glass and navigated through the crowd, which parted with the enthusiasm of people avoiding contamination. He reached the circle of power surrounding Andros and executed what he hoped was the appropriate bow for addressing a lord in formal setting while under observation by hostile nobility. There were so many ways to screw up Ithari etiquette that humans had developed entire training programs just to minimize diplomatic disasters. "My lords, my ladies," Andros said, gesturing at Kale like he was presenting an exotic specimen. "Lieutenant Kale Torin, who distinguished himself during our recent unpleasantness by saving my brother's life when letting him die, would have been strategically advantageous." "How noble," Lady Charis said, and her tone suggested nobility was a character defect. "Tell me, Lieutenant, do all humans possess this suicidal commitment to impractical mercy?" "Not all of us, my lady. Some of us are perfectly capable of practical selfishness. I just have terrible timing." A ripple of something moved through the assembled nobles, and Kale couldn't tell if it was amusement or offense. With the Ithari, the line was thin enough to require quantum mechanics to measure. "Your species fought us to a stalemate," Lord Ven said, his ears tilted back in what Kale had learned meant aggressive challenge. "Yet you claim weakness and humor as virtues. Explain this contradiction." "No contradiction, my lord. We're weak individually, so we learn to work collectively. We use humor to diffuse tension because holding grudges takes energy better spent on survival. We're not strategically brilliant. We're just really, really stubborn about not dying." "But stubbornness is not strategy," High Minister Kelrose said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to pronouncing judgments. "It is merely delay of inevitable defeat. With respect, Minister, stubbornness is exactly our strategy. Humanity's entire approach to galactic politics is we're going to be here whether you like it or not, so we might as well figure out how to coexist." Kale kept his tone light, conversational, even as he felt the weight of hostile attention. "We're like that neighbor who moves in next door, plays music too loud, but always helps with the lawn maintenance. Annoying but ultimately harmless." "Harmless," Lady Charis repeated. "Is that how you describe a species that cost us 3 fleets and 17,000 lives?" The hall had gone quiet, that particular quality of silence that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Kale felt sweat forming under his formal jacket, but he'd learned during the war that showing fear to the Ithari was like bleeding in shark-infested water. "No, my lady, those weren't harmless. Those were desperate. There's a difference between being weak and being unwilling to fight, and humanity learned that difference when we realized the galaxy didn't care about our good intentions." He met her gaze, saw the calculation there. "We didn't want that war. We're still not sure we survived it, but we're here now, and we can either spend the next century killing each other, or we can figure out if there's another option." "And what option would that be?" Lord Ven asked. "Honestly, I have no idea. That's why Lord Andros invited me here, I think, to see if humans and Ithari can exist in the same space without it ending in explosions. So far, I've managed 3 weeks without causing any diplomatic incidents, which I'm told is a record for my species." Andros smiled at that, and Kale couldn't tell if it was genuine or predatory. Possibly both. 3 weeks, the Lord said, during which you have trained with our warriors, studied our history, and carefully avoided any situation that might be construed as taking advantage of house hospitality. The way he said it made Kale's instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite interpret. Something was happening here, some test he hadn't recognized until it was already in motion. I'm a guest in your house, my lord. Taking advantage would be poor repayment for your hospitality. How very restrained. Andros' eyes gleamed with something Kale definitely didn't like. Tell me, Lieutenant, my household staff have observed your interactions with my daughter. They note you maintain careful distance, avoid private conversation, refuse opportunities for closer association. Is this human protocol, or do you find Lady Lyra Velshara displeasing? The hall didn't just go quiet. It went silent in a way that suggested oxygen had been removed from the immediate vicinity. Kale's brain went into emergency override, simultaneously processing the question, the context, the audience, and the fact that Lyra herself stood 20 paces away, her expression frozen in that neutral mask the Ithari used when they were absolutely not neutral about something. I'm sorry, my lord, I'm not sure I understand the question. It's quite simple. Andros spread his hands in a gesture that looked generous but felt like a trap closing. You are young, unattached in the presence of a woman of extraordinary standing and capability. Yet you avoid her as if she carries plague. Explain this curiosity. Why don't you touch my daughter, human? Every eye in the hall locked onto Kale. The nobles leaned forward fractionally, predators sensing blood. Sira had gone absolutely still at the hall's edge. Thyros stood near his father, his expression unreadable. And Lyra, her silver eyes fixed on Kale with an intensity that felt like gravity itself. The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Kale realized with crystalline clarity that whatever he said next would define not just his own fate, but possibly humanity's entire relationship with the Ithari dominion. No pressure. He took a breath, met Lord Andros' ancient gaze, and decided that if he was going to hang himself with words, he might as well be honest about it. Kale felt the weight of 300 years of Ithari nobility pressing down on him, generations of conquest and dominance, and taking what they wanted without apology. He thought about the war, about the friends he'd lost to ships that didn't come back, about the human colonies reduced to debris fields, because humanity had stumbled into a galaxy that operated on rules nobody had bothered to explain. He thought about Lyra in the library, showing him restricted archives because she wanted him to understand. About Thyros on the training mat, reassessing everything he thought he knew about human weakness. About 3 weeks of tests disguised as hospitality, and hospitality disguised as tests. She's too pure, Kale said, and his voice carried in the silence without effort, clear and steady despite the fact that his heart was attempting to escape through his ribcage. Lord Andros' eyebrow rose fractionally. Around the hall, nobles exchanged glances that probably meant they were already composing reports about the human spectacular failure. Kale pressed forward because stopping now would be worse than whatever disaster he was driving toward. Not pure as you might mean it, he continued, keeping his eyes on Andros because looking at Lyra right now would shatter whatever composure he'd managed to maintain. Not untouched or sheltered or any of those concepts that I'm told the Ithari find quaint. Pure in the way that fire is pure, or starlight. Your daughter burns with intelligence and purpose. She carries the weight of House Velshara's future on her shoulders, and she does it with a dignity that frankly scares me a little. Someone in the crowd made a sound that might have been surprise or offense. Kale couldn't tell and decided he was already committed to the catastrophe, so he might as well be thorough about it. You want to know why I maintain distance? Because in my culture, we have this concept you might find bizarre. We believe that some things are too valuable to simply take. That desire without respect is just appetite, and appetite alone doesn't honor either party. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like insults or propositions or any of the thousand ways this could go wrong. I don't avoid your daughter because I find her displeasing, Lord Andros. I avoid overstepping because she deserves better than to be another test for the primitive human to pass or fail. The silence had weight now, pressure that made his ears pop like rapid altitude change. Kale saw Sierra near the wall, her expression caught between horror and something that might have been respect. Thyros had gone completely still, watching his father for cues on whether to be offended on his sister's behalf. Among my people, Kale said, and he was aware he was probably ending his diplomatic career and possibly his life expectancy. We have an old word. Courtship, the idea that some connections are built rather than claimed, that the greatest strength isn't in what you can take, but in what you choose to honor. He finally looked at Lyra, saw those silver eyes wide with something he couldn't name. Your daughter isn't a prize for me to win or a diplomatic tool for you to deploy, my lord. She's a person who deserves the respect of being seen as such. So yes, I've kept my distance. Not from weakness, from respect. The silence stretched so long that Kale started calculating escape routes, despite knowing that running from an Ithari noble house was approximately as effective as running from gravity itself. Then Lord Andros threw back his head and laughed, a sound like thunder rolling through the hall. Respect, Andros said, and his laughter subsided into something that might have been genuine amusement. The human speaks of respect while standing in a hall full of people who wanted his species exterminated 6 months ago. He turned to the assembled nobility, spreading his arms. Do you hear this? He refuses advantage because it would dishonor the one he's refusing. What manner of species operates on such backwards logic? A stupid one, Kale offered, because if the Lord was laughing, maybe he wasn't about to order an execution. We've been told that repeatedly, usually right before we do something that shouldn't work but does anyway. Stupid or wise? Lady Charas asked, and her tone had shifted from hostile to something closer to curiosity. I cannot decide which. Both, probably, Kale said. Humans are very good at being contradictory. It's one of our few consistent traits. Lord Ven stepped forward, his ears tilted in that aggressive posture that Kale had learned to be wary of. You claim to honor my host's daughter through distance and restraint, yet this is the opposite of how power operates. The strong take what they desire. This is natural law. With respect, my lord, natural law also says that species too weak to compete go extinct. Humanity should have died a dozen times over, but we're still here because we learned that cooperation beats competition when you're outgunned by everything else in the galaxy. Kale felt the words flowing now, 3 weeks of observation crystallizing into understanding. The Ithari value strength and dominance because you've never had to be weak. You've never had to figure out how to survive when everyone else is bigger, faster, and better armed. We have. And what we learned is that respect and restraint aren't weakness. They're how you build alliances when you can't afford to make more enemies. Philosophy from a soldier, High Minister Kelrose said, but his tone had lost its edge. Perhaps humanity is more complex than our intelligence suggested. Oh, we're definitely more complex, Kale said. Mostly because we're a mess of contradictions held together by stubbornness and caffeine. But we're your mess now, Minister. The war ended. We're neighbors whether anyone likes it or not. The question is whether we spend the next century trying to kill each other, or whether we figure out if there's value in our differences. Andros had stopped laughing, but something in his expression had shifted. 3 weeks, he said quietly. 3 weeks I have tested you, pushed you, arranged situations that would reveal your true nature. My warriors could not break you. My daughter could not provoke you. My hospitality could not seduce you into error. He moved closer, and Kale held his ground despite every instinct screaming to retreat. Do you know what conclusion I have reached, Lieutenant Torin? That humans are too stubborn to know when we're beaten. That humanity is dangerous in ways we did not anticipate. Not because you are strong, but because you refuse to behave as the weak should behave. You do not submit. You do not rage. You simply persist, and you make us question assumptions we have held for millennia. Andros placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, and the gesture somehow felt both threatening and respectful. You have given me much to consider. Lyra moved through the crowd then, and nobles parted before her with the deference due to house nobility. She stopped in front of Kale, her expression still unreadable, her ears held in that neutral position that gave nothing away. "You think I'm too pure to touch," she said, and her voice carried across the hall. "You maintain respect through distance." "Yes, my lady. And if I told you that in Ithari culture, such restraint is not respect but insult, that refusing offered opportunity suggests I am unworthy of consideration." Kale's brain stuttered over that possibility, 3 weeks of cultural briefings colliding with the immediate crisis. Then I would apologize for the insult and explain that human cultural translation is apparently terrible, which we also knew, but hoped wouldn't cause diplomatic incidents. Her ears twitched forward, and the corner of her mouth curved in something that was definitely, finally, a smile. "Your species is absurd. We really are, it's kind of our thing." "Walk with me tomorrow," she said, and it wasn't quite a command but wasn't quite a request. "In the gardens. We will discuss this concept of courtship and whether it has any value in a galaxy that operates on strength." "I would be honored, my lady." She inclined her head, turned, and walked back through the crowd with her attendants falling into formation behind her. The assembled nobility watched this exchange with expressions ranging from bafflement to calculation, probably already composing reports to their respective houses about the bizarre human who turned down advantage in favor of abstract principles. Lord Andros clapped Kale on the shoulder again, harder this time. "You may survive this posting after all, Lieutenant, though I suspect you will give my house many headaches in the process." "It's what I do best, my lord." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and crystalline nectar and nobles who suddenly wanted to know more about human culture, and whether all humans were as strange as their representative. Kale fielded questions, made jokes that sometimes landed and sometimes didn't, and tried not to think about the fact that tomorrow he'd be walking in gardens with Lyra Velshara, attempting to explain human courtship to someone whose species considered taking what you wanted to be the highest virtue. Later, much later, Sira found him on one of the observation platforms, staring at 3 moons that hung in defiance of reasonable orbital mechanics. "You're either very brave or very stupid," she said, offering him another glass of luminescent liquid. "I'm going with stupid," Kale said, accepting the drink. "It's more consistent with human tradition. You changed something tonight, in that hall, the way they look at your species. Or I just confused everyone thoroughly, hard to tell." "No," Sira said quietly. "You showed them that strength can look different than they thought, that maybe there's power in choosing restraint. It's not a lesson the Ithari learn easily." Kale sipped his drink and watched the moons drift in their impossible orbits. Somewhere below, the citadel hummed with power and politics and generations of tradition. Somewhere in that maze of crystal and starlight, Lyra was probably analyzing his words, dissecting his intentions, deciding whether humanity was worth her time. Tomorrow he'd walk in gardens with a woman whose species had tried to exterminate his, and they'd talk about courtship